Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan and on this week's episode, I'm joined by Teagasc specialist Tim Hyde to discuss the Targeted Agricultural Modernisation Scheme, also known as TAMS. In January, the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine announced it was extended. I first asked Tim, has the eligibility criteria changed and who is eligible to apply?
For TAMS, the eligibility criteria has not changed, Catherine. It's still open to all farmers and farms. They must have had a BPS submitted in the previous year or in the previous year of maybe applying this year. Just to be aware that, there is two schemes. There is a 60% scheme for young farmers and all other farmers are eligible for 40%. For 60% young farmer scheme, they have to be trained, done an agricultural qualification, or they're doing it at the moment, and less than 5 years since they applied for the herd number. But to get the 60% for the young farmer scheme, they must be the only name on the herd number or be a registered farm partnership. We have low emissions as well, which is still eligible under TAMS, and that is at 40 and 60% as well. And the farmer must apply under the young farmer scheme to get the 60%. And look, TAMS applications are normally submitted in a 4-month window every year. And just a few things, Catherine, about the eligibility criteria. Once you're approved for TAMS, it's very important that people follow the department specification for the works that they're doing. And it's a good idea to give those specifications to the builders to make sure it's done to the right specification. And last but not least, once they are approved, is to make sure that whatever payments they make for items that they're approved for, that comes out of their own bank account, the same bank account for the herd number. And HP, hire purchase or leasing, is not permitted. So the eligibility in general hasn't changed, Catherine.
And are there payment ceilings in relation to the 60% and 40% approval that you're after mentioning?
Yeah, very good point, Catherine. Yeah, for most farmers out there who don't fall into the young farmer category, the scheme ceiling is 80,000. So you can apply for multiple items up to the 80,000 ceiling. Now you can go over it if you want, but that's all that you'll get at the 40% grant data on for for non-young farmers. For younger farmers, there's a 60% grant rate up to 80,000, and if those young farmers are in a partnership, the scheme ceiling goes to 160,000, and they can get 60% of the first 80,000 and 40% of the remaining 80,000. And of course, just to clarify, that all partnerships can get a scheme ceiling up to 160,000, even if they're not young trained farmers in that partnership.
And if a farmer had applied and maxed out their investment ceiling at the end of 2020, are they eligible to apply again in 2021?
Unfortunately not, Catherine. It's still the same scheme ceiling for whether you applied pre the end of 2020 or after. It's still 80,000 over the TAMS 2 scheme application period, which started several years ago and is running on, we hopefully, until the end of this year. So if you've already applied for 80,000, you're up to your scheme limit. Now you could possibly go into a registered farm partnership and avail of the extra 80,000 under the registered farm partnership.
Okay. And for someone that has not gone through the process of applying for a grant aid before, how does it work?
Okay, well, look, the application process is complex enough. What I'd say is that I'd advise farmers to talk to their agricultural consultant or Teagasc advisor. And as there are a limited number of applications that can be submitted or that are approved each tranche, it's also important as well that they would have a look at there's a ranking and scoring system there for every application that goes in. And about 20% of applications in each tranche don't get approved. They're rolled over to the next tranche. And it would be important that when farmers apply, they obviously apply through AgFood or their agent does it for them on their behalf. It's important that you try and make sure that you have a look at the marking sheet, and there are marks for different criteria within it. Age and size of holding, whether you're in an A and C area, etc. But it's important that you maximize the marks so that your chances of being approved are a lot higher within each tranche. But again, they can apply through the AgFood site themselves or through an agent can do it on their behalf.
Tim, what's the approximate timescale of each stage of the process from application to approval and then from the time the claim is submitted to payment?
It'll all depend whether you need planning or not, Catherine. And just to clarify, if you need planning, such items as slat sheds, sheep sheds, slat tanks, manure pits, silage pits all need planning permission. And they're a small selection of the items that do need planning permission. But you have to have full planning permission in place, which is the C3 from the local authority, before you can actually apply and hit the submit button. But once you have that done, and as I said, they fall into 4-month tranches, and we're in the middle of a 4-month tranche at the moment. And what if you apply towards the latter end of that tranche? Well, then you have to wait. All the applications in that tranche are then, after that deadline is finished, then the department will look at all the applications that have come in. They'll score them and rank them, and then they'll start sending out approval letters, which normally takes place about 2 to 3 months after the tranche date is finished. And once you get your approval letter, well, then you can start your building works or whatever works you have to do. Now, if you have applied for mobile equipment, once you send in an application, you could possibly put on a deposit or pay for that equipment in full, but you are still under the behest of the Department of Agriculture to get approval for that item.
And you mentioned there about the process for applying for planning permission. How do you go about applying for planning?
Well, Catherine, the first thing you would need to do is you need to have a thought in your head about where you're going to put the shed, what size of a shed you need. Then you would engage with your Teagasc advisor or consultant to see, well, look, what's the best shed I need? Where do I start with? Do I need storage or do I need loose housing or whatever? And then once you have a guideline of the drawings that you need, go to a draftsperson or an engineer who will draw up the designs of the shed for you to fit your own particular situation. And then you go through the planning process with the draftsperson. But I would say it's very, very important that before you submit the planning permission application to the local authority, that you would show the final set of drawings to your consultant to make sure that they comply with the department specifications, so that once you get planning permission and you apply, it's kind of a seamless process. It meets all the requirements when it goes into the department and approvals, etc. But in normal situations, once you start looking to do getting a draftsperson involved, you're talking 3 to 4 months, maybe 5 months due to COVID delays in local authorities to get planning permission approved, and then you can submit your application.
Okay. And you mentioned there that cattle handling equipment is also available under the scheme. What kind of cattle handling equipment is available?
There's quite a list of items available under TAMS for all items, whether it be cattle handling or sheep handling units. So I'd say to a farmer that's listening is get a list of those off the department website. But it covers such thing as handling yards, single-sided or double-sided cattle crushes, races, backing gates, head scoops. And on the sheep side, there's mobile sheep equipment, and there's also mobile cattle equipment handling units as well. So get the full list and see which interest you. But from a cattle handling facility, people can apply to put up a cattle handling unit with the cattle crush in it. And it's normally based on the size of the unit that you can go for. The collecting yards or the handling yards, if you want to call them, is roughly, you're allowed 2 meters squared per bovine animal you have on the farm. So some of them may be 30 suckler cows and followers. They might have 60, 70 cattle on the farm at any stage during the year, and they can get 2 meters squared for every animal they have. So 70 by 2, 140 square meters of a holding yard is what they could apply for, and then within that holding yard you put in the crush, etc. Now, just one thing to be careful, Catherine, is that the cattle handling facilities normally don't need planning permission where they are located more than 10 meters from a public road, or they're not within 100 meters of dwelling houses and other buildings. So it's important to make sure that when you are thinking about doing that, if it's maybe on an out farm, which they are ideally suited to, is to ensure that you're meeting all the planning requirements, which means you don't need planning, and then you can submit your application once you have a drawing done up with your advisor.
And what are the most common items that you're seeing that cattle farmers are applying for?
Oh, it's very varied, Catherine, but I suppose the most common items are obviously animal housing, whether it be a slat shed or a loose house or calving boxes. Obviously, if there's a slat shed, there's slat tanks going with it as well. We have quite a lot of high interest in, you mentioned cattle handling units already, sheep fencing, low emission slurry equipment, and one of the smaller items that's granted as well is the replacement of slats on existing slat tanks. But those slat tanks that the slats are going on must meet a certain specification. They can't be block walled, and they must have been built to a reasonable standard in the last number of years.
And with the BS scheme last year, there was an increased interest in the weighing of animals on farm, and a significant number of farmers would have been renting scales to weigh their stock. If a farmer was to apply for a TAMS aided grant for a weighing scale, what does it cost?
Okay, so the first point I'll come to there, Catherine, is that if you make an application, the proposed cost of the items you're applying for must be at least €2,000. The weighing scales that you're talking about is that now there are so many different types out there and specifications out of different weighing scales supplied out there. But the department costing of which we is the reference cost is what we have to use for making applications. The reference cost the department has is €1,164 for a weighing scales. But again, that's below the 2,000 minimum application. So you might think about putting in for a backing gate and a head scoop. Maybe, there are items there, other safety items around the yard, such as, outside lights, outside buildings, rewiring sheds. So you look at the total, get the list of items that are eligible. If you're thinking of doing a weighing scales, you have to put a couple of more items with it. And make sure that your application is over €2,000.
That's great, Tim. You mentioned there the reference costs on eligible investments in TAMS. How are they calculated?
Well, the department have a standard document which has all the reference costs for every item that's within grant aidable within TAMS. And the department have picked those costs based on a standard set of costs around. Let's say if it's weighing scales, they take 3 or 4 different suppliers and say what the average cost is. Now, in some instances, the reference costs, which were drawn up a couple of years ago and are still the ones we use today, are a little bit lower than what's out there in the marketplace. But as a guide, they are the average costs of what things are out there.
And you mentioned earlier that there was already 20 tranches of TAMS and that the Minister has announced amendments to the scheme for the new tranche. What did the new changes consist of?
Yeah, good question, Catherine. There are a few new things in there. There are GPS fertilizer spreaders that have come in the last couple of months for all farmers. And there's also 2 items there for calf feeding, which is computerized calf feeders. And secondly, milk carts with mixers are now grant aided under TAMS. One thing that has been dropped off the list is low emission slurry spreading equipment for derogation farmers who applied for derogation in the years 2019, 2020 or 2021. They're no longer eligible for those.
And when does the next tranche close, Tim?
Okay, the next tranche closes on the 16th of April. What we normally see is that there will be another tranche maybe 3-4 months after that. So if TAMS is going to be rolled over, and there was money in the budget announced last autumn for it, so we hope and expect that it will be there after this tranche, which finishes on the 16th of April, and that there will be a couple of more rounds of tranches between the 16th of April and the end of the year that farmers can avail of.
Tim, a wide variety of items available. Thanks very much for joining me on the show.
Thanks, Catherine.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to Tim for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.